going to start at the beginning. Over the next probably months, we're going to talk about building a software project. We're going to go all the way through it. We're going to walk through all the steps so that it's going to be a learn by example. It's going to be a tutorial. It's going to be a learn by example, but also I'm going to be pushing along the way to sort of do in parallel your own project. Is pick something, and it may be the project you do in parallel may be something that you're already doing at work, and it's going to be just sort of retrofitting some of these steps into some of the things that we'll cover. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go further down the presentation. The other option is that you build your own, pick an idea, pick something that you want to build, and start building it. And the pace of this will probably be such that you could put together a pretty decent little application, along the way. And I think this is going to end up being, to at least some extent, it will be a technology specific. I haven't nailed down the technology yet. That will be actually something we'll discuss down the road a little bit here. It probably will not be Java. I may do like a little PHP app, or I may even do something, a little less popular. I may do like a Ruby on Rails, or I may do a Python Django or something like that. I haven't figured out where I want to go yet with it, but that'll be part of our discussion as we go along with this. If you do something that you pick a different technology, I'm going to try to keep all of these presentations so that they'll still be applicable. They'll be a little more, they'll be more theoretical than actual, like getting down into syntax. Although I may actually, there'll probably be code examples and things like that, so you can at least see some flows, and then hopefully you'll just be able to translate those to whatever technology you use, assuming you choose a different technology. So starting out, the first thing to do in creating a software solution of any kind is, let's figure out what problem are we solving. First thing we want to do is there's got to be a reason for doing the project in the first place. If there's not a problem that you're solving, if you're not doing anything, if you're just writing code to write code, then it's not really a project. Nothing else really makes sense. And so, it usually should be like one problem. If you're trying to solve 50 problems at once, it's going to be too much. The scope's going to be too difficult. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. That's that whole idea of focusing and not getting too splintered in your efforts. In any software project, the same way. And really any project, we're just talking about software, and software happens to be, I think, as we've all seen, it's very easy to splinter your focus with software. The example project I'm going to be working forward with is the problem I want to solve is a way to keep track of our goals and how we're doing on them. And this includes annual goals, and it's going to filter down to quarter and monthly. So as we've done our, at the beginning of the year, we looked at setting goals for at this point for 2017. We looked at what we're going to do in first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. And then as we've gone through January, February, etc., we've done monthly goals. And then we've set them at the beginning of the month, and then we come back and review them at the end of the month. So what this project's going to be, which I think is something that will be useful to us when we're done with it, is an application that does that, an application that will allow us to keep track of those goals. So we'll have an electronic record of it, and keep track of those and report on them essentially. Now, as I mentioned, the initial problem we want to solve should not be more than a few core issues. If there's more than one problem to solve, then which should not be too common. More often than not, you stick to really one major problem. But any of the related other ones should essentially be like sub problems or closely related. A big problem may have a lot of sub problems, but you really want to focus on that big problem and keep it constrained to that and keep it as tight as possible. So, for example, with this one, I could have said I just want a way to keep track of goals. Well, that could quickly become I want to do annual goals. I want to do daily tasks. I want to do email lists to to customers. I want to track all of my time on it. I want to do there's just, you guys have seen some of these project management type software that's out there that's it does that, but it's also a huge team, and they've built those features up over years and releases and things like that. Hopefully, if they did it in one big shot, they probably had a lot of issues making it successful because they tried to do too many things at once. So we've got our one big problem we're going to solve with this one is a goal sort of thing. And then for those of you guys who are familiar with the Freedom Journal, it is an example of a hardware of a book of a hardware version of this solution. Basically, that's sort of how they do it. I mean, obviously they're different because they focus on 100 days and getting your tasks. But if you look at a journal like that, and there's some other competing products that are out there that are essentially do the same thing, that are really just, or even like Franklin planners and things like that. But this is going to be a electronic way, and we're going to do it a little more focused towards how we do things, as far as work from an annual goal, work our way to quarters and months. So it's going to be it's going to be customized to our approach that we've gotten comfortable with. So some examples of big products, or really sites, and the problems they wanted to solve. If you look at Uber, really they just wanted to provide a way to crowdsource taxi services. I mean, I don't know that they actually wrote that down anywhere. I don't know if that was something that they had in mind. But if you look at what the app does, if you were to retrofit it, that's probably the big problem that they solve. I mean, that doesn't mean that's the only feature they have, but that's their focus. If you look at Facebook, and actually you can go back and if you look at interviews with Zuckerberg about how he got to it and things like that, initially it was just a way to easily keep up with other people, with other school chums and things like that. You can see what it's grown into over the years. So it's because it's had other iterations and other little projects that have been tacked on top of it over the years. But the initial project, that was their problem they wanted to solve. Google, same thing. Google is huge. They're a gargantuan company. They do all this stuff. But the initial problem they wanted to solve was just provide a way to search the internet. So let's go looking at defining requirements and use cases. Because that's, once we've got the problem, that's our next step. Use case, if you don't know, simply put, it's a path through the application to achieve a purpose. It has a real world basis, and it's basically us saying this is what happens in the real world, and we're going to want to model this in the application. For example, a real world use case would be, I want to do a withdrawal from my savings account. You would have a use case where a person comes in, they put the card in, enter their keypad, their PIN, yada yada. It ends up with they have some money, or they have a little receipt that says you don't have enough funds. As you're building use cases, you want to consider each path as a way to solve the main problem or a related task. So put more simply, each use case that you're building when you're designing this should point back to that main problem, and either directly to the main problem or something that is required to get to that main problem. So something that would point to the main problem in the banking situation would be, I want to be able to get money out of an ATM. Well, the use case of entering your card, putting your card into the machine, entering an ID, selecting an amount, that would be a primary use case. But there may be a side use case of, I need to be able to check my balance, or a side use case of, need to be able to deposit money. So all your use cases, which is why we start with the big problems, because we want something to focus everything going forward. And like I said, related tasks, they must also be administration, configuration, or solution delivery along with the other options. So a lot of times your use cases are going to be things like, I have an application with users. Well, I also need a use case to handle adding users, deleting users, activating, deactivating users, things like that. Start with the basics, and then grow out from there. That's going to be the easiest way to do it. Is you get very close, you start very close to the primary problem that you want to solve, and then you're going to start adding and adding and adding to that to get to your full featured application. There's of course some point where you want to cut that out, but the nice thing is if you start from your main problem and grow out of that, then it's easy to cut scope later because you can basically just start cutting all those ancillary things. You can look at it and say, this use case 58, I don't really need this. It's just I've gone too far with it. So start simple, start at the core, grow out, and as we're going to see, that will help you build future use cases down the road, because as you solve those core problems, there are going to be things going to drop out that are going to be ancillary problems to address. When we start looking at them professionally, use case can be very complex. They can take up pages of documentation. If you look at templates, if you go out there and search for like use case templates, there's a bunch out there, but some of them are huge documents in themselves for any given use case. It'll be 10, 20 pages. The examples we're going to use are going to be simpler. We're going to drop a few common attributes that you see, like stakeholder and a few other fields, but they're still going to be very functional, and they are useful for professional development of software, because I've used very similar things on a regular basis and people are very happy with them. And more importantly, they serve the purpose of documenting the requirements and the flows of the application. As I said, if you want to look for use case templates, there's dozens, if not hundreds out there. There's sites that give you them in, for Word, for Excel, for Pages, for you name it. And there's a lot of different formats of them. So if if your boss asks you to do one, or if you've got a customer that's asking you to do some, and you don't want to start from scratch, grab a template, and they're usually pretty easy to figure out and fill out as you go. So some example use cases is, and really a use case, like I said, it's a path, it's a real world task or a path through, and it ends up being a path through the application. So in our case, a user wants to enter annual goals. If we're going to be able to track them, obviously one of the use cases, they've got to be able to enter them. They need to enter progress on them. They want to be able to track how they've progressed on them. They need to be able to complete a goal. It's very similar to progression. Being able to enter progress on a goal. Also, they want to complete it. Those may be combined, but it's just to give us some extra granularity. A user is probably going to need to build goals based on longer term goals. We talked about going from annual down to quarter down to monthly. So obviously, we're going to be able to want a way to tie monthly goals back to annual goals, weekly goals or monthly goals to quarterly goals to annual goals. And with all of that, another use case would be being able, user needs to jump in and it's like, hey, how am I doing? Where am I at whatever time frame it is? So there's some example use cases. That is not, that is not necessarily complete. And depending on how you do it, you may, as I said, you may combine some use cases, you may not. The ideal way to do it is put some together, say, okay, here's some initial ideas of use cases. And then as we start working into them, what will end up happening is you'll find that, okay, this is too complex or too simple. So it's either too complex and I need to split it into maybe two use cases, or it's too simple and it makes more sense for me to combine that with something else. As I mentioned several times, it's very key. As you create use cases, other ones may drop out of it. It may suddenly appear that, oh, hey, I've got this use case I need to handle. In general, a use case is going to include an actor, maybe multiple actors, preconditions and postconditions, and they may be none, but in most cases, there's, preconditions are your assumptions and postconditions are your output. If you don't have either of those, then it probably isn't a use case, because there's not, like, why do it? If you don't, if you're not doing something at the end of the day, if you don't have a post condition, then probably didn't need to do that in the first case. It's going to have a main path because this is basically with the use case. And if you're thinking in QA terms, the main path in a use case is the happy path or the success path. It's the one that this is, it's a, or if you're thinking of positive testing, this is the path that is if everything goes right. And then you're going to have with it, you're going to either have exceptions or extensions, which are ways to handle exceptions, errors, or other failures in the process, or anything where that process may, where your use case, where the steps may not be successful going from step to step. For ease of reading, so that you can actually track these things, because most software is going to have more than one use case. It's going to have multiples. You're going to have a title, a description, and a lot of times an ID, even in very simple ones, like if I'm doing something here, I'm going to have some IDs because it just makes it easier for me to roll them up and refer to them elsewhere. So if I'm doing bug tracking later, if I'm if I'm splitting work off to somebody else and they've got a full design and requirements document that happens to have all of these use cases, and whether it's as part of the main design or maybe it's an addenda or maybe some section at the end, then it's an easy way to just jump right to it instead of using its title or some longer form method of describing that use case. So I laid out a couple of examples, and so now I'm going to walk through actually detailing these a little bit more, going into building a use case. So one of the first things we talked about was entering an annual goal. That's what we want a user to be able to do. So you can see I threw an ID up there. This is just goals 1, which is, you can call it whatever you want. You could call it Bob 1. You could call it Bob A. You could call it goal A. You could just call it goals. It just depends on how you want to do it, as long as it makes sense to you as the designer and whoever the audience is. I do recommend consistency, as we'll talk about later in design and architecture and other things. Whatever process you decide on, it doesn't really matter as long as you have something that is consistent and reproducible. If it's not, then it's going to make it very difficult for anybody else to look at it and figure it out, because it's just going to be, if you don't have naming conventions, if you don't have standards that you follow, then it's going to be confusing to anybody looking at it, because they will make assumptions even if they should not. Like here, goals 1 probably assumes that there's going to be a goals 2. If every idea I have is, goals 1, user 1, output 1, it's going to be like, okay, why did I have those ones there in the first place? It's confuse the user. Title is something user friendly again. Description is the same thing. And with the description, you want enough there for yourself to note that this is my goal, this is my use case, and this is really what I want it to do. We talked about use cases have an actor. In this case, it's primary actor, and it's actually the only actor. Is going to be a registered application user. Preconditions, we talked about this, is where do you start? What are you assuming? In this case, we're going to assume that the user is logged into the system. Post conditions is, if they want to enter an annual goal, our post condition is at the end of it, then they're going to have goal data that has been saved for that user that enters it. Now we get into the success scenario. This is your happy path. The user is going to select an option to create a new goal. They've logged in, they're at their home screen essentially, and through something, and this again, notice that we haven't said through a menu, through a button, whatever it is, we've implied that there's going to be an option for the user to select to create a new goal. They're going to select the goal size of annual, so that because we've said up at the top, title is annual goal. We know that monthly and weekly exist also, so they're going to have some way to select the type. Then they're going to enter at least, we know at least they're going to cover a goal name, an estimated time to complete the goal, a difficulty, general size, target year, and description. Now that's stuff that now we're actually starting to put some requirements sort of together within our use cases. But note that we haven't mentioned any of that before, but we're putting it in this use case because we want to to maintain. We want to track that that's information at least that we want to track as part of a goal. At that point, once users enter their data, they're going to save the goal. Step 5, there's going to be some sort of validation required because we want to validate the data. We're not going to just say save and done. And then we're going to store the data in the system. We're not going to send them an email. We're not going to do anything else. We know that we do want to store the data. So, it seems very simplistic, but that's sort of the goal of use cases, is to take something big, like for example, that whole you don't eat an elephant in one bite. You take a lot of small bites. That's what we want to do with the use cases, is make it very simple, very understandable, and very clear that this is how the process goes. The extensions is where you're going to cover any additional notes and exceptions. So here we see that the first one is that the name and time to complete are required. We talked about validation. And so we've actually added a little bit of a note here that one of the things we're going to be validating is that there's a name and that there's a time to complete entered for the goal. We've noted that in step item 2 there, I guess it is that goal name and the target year are going to combine as a unique key. So we know that if I enter a goal name of Rob's goal for 2017, then there is not going to be another Rob's goal 2017. Whether that's for the user or for the entire system remains to be seen, but we've at least specified that much. And the user is allowed to quickly add another new goal as well. So it's simply stating there that, by the way, when we enter a goal, there should be a way to quickly enter successive goals. Haven't detailed it too much, which is what we want to avoid. We don't want to get too detailed. We don't want to get deep into the specification at this point. We just want to make some notes that say, hey, this is some general usage, and we want to track those early on. Those are things that we're going to require of this system. Frequency of use is one of the things that you want to use, because it's really to set your priorities later, but it helps you also just as you're going through it to say, okay, like I said, you want to get the frequency, you want to get the frequent uses done. If it's rare or one-off or something like that, then that would be something that you might even, you might scope it out of an early release. So we've got our goals 1 use case put together. So now we had a goals 1, let's do a goals 2. So once we've entered a goal, next use case, let's look at entering progress on a goal. Got some very similar stuff we're going to see. We're going to select a goal. We're going to enter progress on that goal. And then other edits like description and some similar values are allowed as well. Notice we've put that in description. Those could be down in the extensions, but we actually have that in description itself. Again, it's a registered application user. Again, we're assuming that the user is logged into the system. And post conditions is the goal is going to be updated for that user. In the main success scenario, this case, user is going to search for a goal because they got to figure out which one they want to edit. We're going to present them the results. They're going to select the goal. They are going to have somehow a way to edit. There's going to be an edit option for the goal that they're going to select. The goal data is presented, which basically we've taken this from the prior use case. We sort of know now, so we're putting together some of the goal data that we're going to track. Here we've added, we have name, description, target year, estimated time to complete. We've added a new thing called log work values. So we've got some way to log work against a goal that now we've implied. The user is going to enter the changes, maybe any work that they've logged towards a goal. They're going to save their changes, and it's going to store that data. Similar to the prior use case, we're going to see that goal name and target year are read-only after the creation step. So we're going to see that those were unique, but now we're also stating that we're not going to be able to edit those in the basically edit progress on a goal, which is also editing a goal. Logging work, we're noting that it's also going to be a timestamp somehow related to that. And that the user doesn't have to, once a user selects to edit a goal, they don't have to, they could actually cancel out and return to the goals list. And this is something to assume, again, this is going to be frequently used because you're going to create goals, you're going to go in, and you're definitely going to log work towards them. So at this point, we've put together a couple of use cases, and now we're starting to see, we've already seen some things are starting to fall into place, and we're going to see some gaps. So as we've already mentioned, as we've been going through these, creating use cases also often will suggest new ones, and they may or may not, but it tends to be pretty typical, particularly the first couple of use cases, that as you're laying those out, you're gonna see some gaps. In the use cases so far, one of the things that we have would be there's some sort of a search use case, and it may be a mini use case, sort of a mini use case that we would use. As we go further into it, it's like, how often are you going to search for goals? What kind of uses are going to come? What are they going to be the follow-up tasks that you're going to do? So it may be that the search itself becomes a use case, because it may have some things like filters and sorts and some of the other features that you would see in a very complex search, that it makes sense to use that as a use case in itself, because it's just that big. Where we look at this, if you go look at the steps that are the happy path plus the extensions, most often you're going to find some requirements that are going to fall out of that when you get into the requirements step. And use cases also tend to imply interfaces, or at least features of interfaces for the project. Use cases, again, all should point towards the big problem to solve. So in this one so far, we've talked about, the big problem is entering and keeping track of goals. We've got one that is entering a goal, and we've got another one that is, adding work to a goal, so it will be keeping track and updating a goal. When the solution is provided, the use cases can provide guidelines for testing. So from a testing point of view, when you get to the end, and this is great from the QA, one of the things that's very valuable in use cases is you get to sort of the end of a project. We actually want to test the solution. Then use cases almost lay out your tests for you. I mean, they're definitely, like I mentioned, these are the positive paths of going through the solution. However it's presented, you should be able to walk a use case through exactly. You should be able to map that exactly to the solution. That with the positive path, and it should work. If it doesn't, obviously, then that's a QA can report that that's a failure. And the use cases should also handle, or at least reference, the negative paths to some extent. So it should say, if this data is bad, this should happen. If this thing doesn't exist, this should happen. So you should be able to.
Which also kind of leads. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So use cases should really help you get those should be your kickstart to, if they're properly done, they should be a kickstart to a testing script. Go ahead with the comment.
Well, I was going to say another thing this kind of brings up in general is this philosophy here also leads into the idea of test-driven development, where you can actually write out your test cases first, or use the use case as a test, and then basically write your code around it to the test.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. This is, as we go down the road, that's we will also see where it helps your testing. Actually, I guess in that case, I'm probably incorrect in the way I initially said it. It actually helps your testing throughout, because you're going to have, and I've done this a lot, where there are use cases, and I'm putting together my unit testing, and my unit tests definitely are informed by the use cases that are put out there, because you want to be able to verify each step along the way that it does work correctly, and that would be unit tests. And then as you get further down the line, the full use cases definitely all have to be supported. So as it's sort of at a system testing level, when you get to the end, your solution should support all of the use cases. If it doesn't, then it will fail. It should fail system testing at that point, because you're going to say this case is not supported, or is not handled correctly. And sort of similar to that, if you think of use cases as a storyboard for an application, as you're building use cases, that means that when you're done with use cases, they should present a complete story of an application. It should work. It should be all of the pieces of the application should be addressed through your use cases. If there's some feature or some usage of the application that's not covered in use cases, then you need to go back and either adjust them or create new use cases.
So,
Question?
I mean, the use cases, I mean, do they come from the BA document, or should the use cases come from the developer himself since he wrote the code? I mean, like the beginning.
It varies. A lot of times, especially with larger companies, the BAs are the ones who are going to actually create the use cases. That's sort of their bailiwick, I guess. A lot of times that gets assigned. If you're a company big enough where you have separate, maybe like designers, architects, developers, and you have some BAs that are out there. However, if it's going to work correctly, if use cases are going to be truly useful, then the best approach is for BAs to create them, but then share them out to the developers, and ideally the developers, the QA, if there's a different group, the architecture and design groups, so that everybody has, essentially gives their blessing and says, yes, that makes sense. And more importantly, that the implementers understand the use cases. And, if there's any, because as always, extra set of eyes doesn't hurt. And from the technical and implementation side, there will be things there that, particularly whoever's actually creating the requirements, there'll be maybe some gaps that they see. It's sort of at that point, it's sort of a gap analysis that they go through. So it varies by team size. If you have BAs, the BAs are going to do it. If you have like a chief designer, or a business unit that's like the owners or the stakeholders, sometimes they will do it. It depends on where the skills fall. But ideally, like I said, it should be something everybody is up to speed on, because everything should point back to that. Developers, even as a developer, I think my biggest frustration in managing other developers is when they don't understand the use cases and they don't point back to that with how they're implementing things, because the use cases will provide you a very good roadmap of what is a bell and whistle and what is a required feature, and key to the usefulness of the application. And if you don't have that, that goes back to the use cases as part of the system testing. If you don't provide a solution to a use case, then you probably are not, you may not be providing a useful solution. Maybe not at all. That may be something where, because that use case is not addressed properly, may make the whole thing, just a load of trash, essentially. So, sort of as a little bit of a class exercise right now, is based on what we've talked about so far. So we've gone through a couple of use cases on this this sample application, example application model application that I'm walking through. What are some things that need to be done? So thinking of the use cases we've got so far, and this is going to end up being some of our, going to be informing our high level requirements, because we'll talk about that in at a later date. But what are some things that we've come up? What are some things that we know we can come up with that are going to need to be done with this application? Not a rhetorical question either. It's like, throw out some idea. What are some things that they're going to need to be built to build this application as we've laid it out so far?
Sorry, I was on mute.
And I'll give a first one out. So for example,
Okay.
we know that we're going to need like a user login or authentication administration piece. We talked about authorized users. The user needed to be registered, logged in. So obviously there has to be some way to do that. So we know we're going to have to define that in the requirements. You guys think of something else?
Validation.
So we're going to need a validation suite piece, something like that. We're going to need some sort of validation functionality. What's something else?
Can you jump back a few?
I hope so.
There we go.
It's cheating.
This helps. I was trying to remember.
Like looking at this one, what's something else?
Yeah, so the validation for like the users, and then let's see, we need to define some the options for the goals.
So goal options and details. What else? Anything else? Anything come to mind, Dave?
Oh, where are we going to, what type of system are we going to store it in?
What the type of data?
Yeah, so storage.
Yeah, like the database,
Yep.
in memory, SQL, stuff like that. Now within this system now, I know based on what we have, it's a high level at this point. There's no purchasing, no billing, nothing like that, right?
No.
Okay.
But I do want to. We'll swing around to that later. Anything else?
The search engine.
So we need some search.
Let's see. Of course, we'll probably need a typical CRUD type interface for each of these.
Yep, some sort of interface to be able to create,
So is this
retrieve,
kind of like
update, delete.
architecture stuff?
What was that, Dave?
Is this like kind of architecture stuff? Is it like not real testing or something like that?
Yeah, this is this would be architecture and design stuff. This is this is taking us to the next step of once if we're building software, we've started at the problem, we've started at putting together some use cases, and so now we're looking at what the next step will be is actually building out some requirements. So this is architecture, design, BA type stuff.
Okay.
All right, so you have enter progress on a goal, and I'm looking at this again. So as they enter their progress, we're going to have multiple entries, or are we going to have kind of any type of analytics or statistics to keep track of how much they're getting done daily?
Yep, good. So
And can you go back to the other one for a second?
yeah.
Sorry. Now that you asked the other question, I'm going back and reading these a little bit differently to kind of fill in the gap. Goal size of annual. All right, now here we had goals for annual. So are we not doing anything for quarterly?
Well,
is this just straight up annual?
Yeah, we'll end up adding that. Those would be extra use cases.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah, sorry.
No, that
just went back and rewrite it. Annual goal. Since we're creating annual goals, do we want to kind of so this is the annuals. Would we want to give them benchmarks? Like say I would like to be like 30% completed by half of the year, or I know that to me that's different than quarterly goals. To me, I have an annual, but it's like, okay, I know first quarter's going to be real like slow, and maybe the first 3 months of the year I expect to only get like 10% done, and then the rest of the year.
Yeah, I that's definitely something we're going to do. I see that as being another use case. Would be the
Okay.
That's really the. Let's see if I can go back to that. That's really like bullet point 4 here. A user needs to build goals based on longer term goals. And as you can note that I had like even, and this isn't complete, is we start with a list of 5, and we only actually have 2 that we've walked through, mostly for time concerns.
Okay, I'm just jumping ahead. That's what I have to say.
No, but it's good to.
That's about all I can think of. Just one thing to consider: do we want to give them the option to copy goals or duplicate?
Yep. So, which is another thing that you may, and again, that's going to be probably a use case.
Right. Because on the tail of that, I would think also give them the ability to create like reoccurring or scheduled goals. So like if they have a task that they have to do every week, or a particular goal that they do multiple times.
So what you're so like this is a perfect example of, so you started out and built, so we've only put, we listed out 5 use cases. We actually spent, some time on 2 use cases, and notice that we already have at least, probably at least 3 or 4 additional use cases that we've already come up with, which is exactly that, which, and maybe you don't have to, but you at least have to answer the question, do I want to, for example, do I want to be able to copy or have recurring goals? If I do, then that would be a use case of, which would be essentially maybe a use case of, okay, a user's been using this for a year, and now they come in, they use it in 2017, now they come in 2018. Do they have to start from scratch? What is that use case? So we can see where, although we've also had some requirements, we've had requirements that have fallen out of this sort of, that have been highlighted as we go through this process. We also have gaps essentially that we've seen as we start thinking about it. And this is exactly why we do this, is so that we don't jump in, like scribble something down on a napkin, send it off to, drop $10,000 on an offshore team and say, go build this. Because if you haven't really thought through some of these things, then those features may or may not exist. And as you go through it, it may be very crucial. Like you said, like the sort of analytics thing, as you called it, being able to sort of score yourself, how have I done, is probably pretty critical to this. But if we haven't specified that out, if we haven't thought it through, then we may not be tracking the data to do that. We may not have the data that's required. Now, we implied that a little bit with the, when you log a time, you've got a timestamp and some stuff like that. So we've got some things that have been implied, but not, the actual reporting on that we haven't talked about. So some of the things, and we've mentioned these, the first one, is reporting, which is basically that analytics. We've got to have, if we're going to do this, we probably want to have some sort of reporting. So we need to, that's going to be part of our requirements. We need to address that. We need to address some sort of, really there's the general reporting of how am I doing, or actually more like general reporting of like, what are my goals? What are my annual goals, my monthly goals, weekly goals, things like that. And you're probably going to want something that's a snapshot of more the analytics side of it, of where am I now? How far am I along? Am I green, yellow, or red in my progression towards a goal? Another thing that always needs to be included as you're thinking about stuff like this would be navigation. This is a little bit some of this is sort of the CRUD related stuff, the create, retrieve, update, delete functionality of data, but it's also things like, in requirements, we're going to figure out, are we going to build a menu? Are we going to have just links? Is it going to be just a bunch of standalone little applications for each use case? How is that going to work? How do they navigate? Are you going to be able to archive or delete records? And then also, you've got multiple users in this thing. Are users going to be able to share their data? Are they going to only have their own data? How's all that going to work? And this is just like, and that's not including, we're going to have some sort of like a validation piece. We're going to need to nail down the details of the goals. We're going to need to nail down how do you specify? It's a weekly, it's an annual, it's a monthly or quarter. I mean, it's a monthly, quarterly, annual goal. How do you do the search?
Now visibility across users kind of brings up a whole nother set of use cases. For example, are your goals going to be team-based? Are you going to have groups, or,
Well, and this is where, and of course, this is where, that it puts that question out, and that's where, that's the key, is where you have to look at, okay, does that solve our big problem? Does it point back to that? So for example of groups, is if you go back to our main problem, if I can jump all the way back, is we need a way to keep track of our goals and how we're doing on them. So it's set up as an individual thing. You could grow it into a group thing, but then what you're doing is you've got scope creep. So you can look at stuff like that, and it may be, that you want to do that. That may make it useful. In which case you may want to you may want to go all the way back and adjust your problem you're really solving. But of course, that's the danger. If you do that, then now you're splintering your focus, because now you've added this whole, as you've said, you've added a whole other level of features and considerations and even use cases at that point. Because if you don't have groups, you don't have any use cases related to groups. If you do have groups, then you have use cases related to how do I create a group, how do I add to a group, delete from a group, share among a group. So it gets back to that
All right,
focus.
so go back to the other list. So that last option you had, the visibility. I'll wait till it comes up.
Okay, so visibility.
Yeah, so visibility across users. So are you just so right there, are you just talking, is this like a public or a private account, or public
All
or
of the
private
above.
goals, not really teams? Okay.
I mean, because that, like that and the one before it, the archive, delete records, those are some things that may or may not be requirement issues. I mean, that's just, but it's something that's, as the requirements, they have to specify that. That's really what happens, is that when you get to the requirements, at least, because we haven't seen it in the use cases so far, we haven't seen anything that has told us whether we're going to have to archive or delete records or even care about it. We haven't seen anything that relates to how users see goals. Can they see everybody's goals? Do they only see their goals? Are they public? Are they private? Can they adjust it? So these are things that, as we're, these are questions that must be answered as we get into requirements. And at this case, since we don't have any use cases that have addressed it, anything that's left over from the use cases has got to be addressed in the requirements, or else you run the danger of making assumptions. And this is by no means is this complete as we look at requirements. This is just some examples of some things that have popped out as you're building your use cases, which is from the design. It's a little bit the BA role, but really also the design, and really doing designing a complete solution, is pointing out how this process does work. Even if you go to like sprints and agile and things like that, you may not have complete use cases and full requirements documents, but if you don't do the general process of that, if you're not actually thinking through use cases and walking through those, and if you're not using those to tie to requirements, then you're going to end up in trouble, because you're going to build something that is quite likely wasn't what was originally envisioned, and possibly something that is useless. So that gets us to the end of this presentation. So this is sort of an assignment we'll come back next week and it's really to get you guys thinking about this, because we are going to sort of walk through this together as we go through our next weeks and months, and are covering some of these topics. So either create a problem that's resolved. Create a problem that's resolved either by an existing or new application. So if you've got a new application you want to build, think about what is that thing going to solve. It comes more, think about a problem that needs solving. In this case, we did goals. Something similar that I considered for this would be solving the problem of tracking time for a client and being able to present that to them. I mean, there's software out there that does it, but that would be a problem that maybe I want to build my own software to do it. It may be something that you're working on. It may be something at work that's a project that you're on, and then just sort of retro figure out what is the problem that it's solving. For that application, use these templates, or if you want, use some others. Write at least 3 to 5 use cases out. And the important thing about this is going through the process, so that as the practice makes perfect. Obviously, I need to practice speaking more often. Practice makes perfect. Is it going in and writing out the use cases is in itself a very valuable exercise. It will help you understand the software process to do it. Even every time you do it, you learn more things. But also for your application that you're going to be working with, it's going to help you think about that. It's going to force you to sit down and think about it a little bit. And in our building our own consultancies and things like that, whether you've got some templates out there or not, this will be some that you can make your own. These will be your Malash consulting templates that I have used for use cases. So if I have a customer that asks me to build something, I can go out to this, and now I've got something that I can show that's, maybe you can do a little branding, you can do a little playing around with some formatting and things like that. Whether it's based on somebody else's template, which you're happy to, welcome to use what I've got. And there will be a PDF version of this out there that you guys can use, or actually I've got some Word docs. I'll probably throw it out in Word format as well, or go out and find something somebody else has used, make it your own, because now you will have some additional content that you will have to be able to provide to customers or employers in the future. And then once you've got those 3 to 5 use cases, just do like a quick, like I did here with the practice analysis of some high level requirements. Do the same thing. Maybe take your use cases and just list out some high level features that are going to be required based on your use cases. Start yourself in the process of gathering and defining some requirements. It's useful to, no matter what your business role is, particularly if you ever get to a point where you are driving a solution, whether you're a designer, an architect, a manager, a lead, a director, an owner of a company, or anything like that, it is very useful to have that skill, both to build solutions and also to assess solutions other people have built, because they should have that information. And you can take it, once you've got an eye towards that, it helps you with gap analysis and things of that nature. So that wraps up this particular presentation. As always, thanks for your time and walking through this and your feedback as we've gone through it. If you have any questions, comments, if you need any assistance, there's always the Developerpreneur Slack channel, but also, info@developerpreneur.com will get to all of us and we can work from there. And obviously you can jump to the site and go to the contact form as well.